Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the president of Mass Medic, and I'm very pleased once again to welcome you to one of our hot topic webinars. Today, we're talking about the top 3 testing tips for successful verification, but I heard from the grapevine that we're going to do a few more than 3. So you're already getting more than you bargained for here with this webinar. I am really pleased to be doing this today with Trisha Boutot from Sunrise Labs. She's the Director of Quality and Testing. And Dave Hibbard, he's also from Sunrise Labs, Director of Programs. Sunrise Labs is a partner of ours at Mass Medic, a content partner, a longtime member, and a terrific member of our community. And this is one of 4 webinars we're going to be doing with them over the course of the rest of this year. And they've always just do a great job of really digging into the topics that you need to hear about. So just a couple tips. You're all, attendees are all in attendee mode, so you don't have to worry about muting your screen or anything like that. We can't hear you, we can't see you, but we want to hear from you. So there's a Q&A tab. Please feel free to put your questions in there at any time during the presentation. I've talked to the panelists and they've allowed me to pipe in with your questions when you have them. So all you have to do is plug that into the Q&A session. They're going to do a presentation probably for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a dedicated Q&A time. But I think we want it to be a conversation rather than a monologue, so just go ahead and pipe those in. Also, we'll be sending out a copy of this recording to everyone who registered for today's event, as well as the slides. So with that, I'm going to hand over the presentation to Trisha. Trisha, take it away from here.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for the introduction. When presented with coming up with a good topic for discussion, this was one of the ideas we came up with, and Dave and I thought it would be a good idea to do this together because we strongly believe that verification is a big piece of development in it, and it starts early. We'll be talking about that quite a bit throughout this webinar. So as Brian mentioned, we had originally planned for the top 3 tips. We're hoping that you'll take away more than just 3. We do plan on a number of learnings in here, including some best practices that'll be done in development and execution of your verification plans, how you're going to actually do your planning based on what your project needs are, your regulatory strategies, and what your risk profile might be. Any strategies that you may want to consider that will help mitigate any risks to your schedule, your budget, and understanding that sometimes the start of verification is often delayed due to things that take place during development, and how we can mitigate those as much as possible. What the benefits are for planning your verification early in your project, and then also implementation of agile methodologies using code reviews, integration testing. So we're hoping that you see these themes throughout the presentation, and as Brian said, if you have any questions, please pop them in there. We'll be happy to discuss those real time. So first and foremost, verification is a partnership. It really is the test team and the development team working together. We all know that verification is confirmation that the device was designed correctly. We need to focus on verification early in a project and make sure that we write our requirements so that they're testable. We may need to consider features that we have to put into the product to allow testing of requirements. So, considerations should be made early and often throughout that development. And then understand that verification isn't just the responsibility of the test engineers. The development team, especially your systems engineering team, needs to be considered and involved throughout the development process.
Yeah, so I want to emphasize that as well. And I think that's part of the reason that Trisha and I wanted to do this presentation together. So if you bring in Director of Programs and Director of Quality, we thought that those two is a good partnership. So As you look, throughout the whole development cycle, there are times where you may have to change code or change some of the features in the product to make sure that it's testable. You want to make sure that early on you're getting QA involved in reviewing requirements, reviewing plans, reviewing even the schedule of that, how long is it going to take to do verification. So it's really a give and take throughout the whole entire development cycle. It's not just that V&V or QA comes in at the very end.
So some of the best practices that we're going to touch on over the next few slides are really around the verification plans, where planning is more than just a plan. We all know that we have to write a verification plan early in the design input or early in design output phase to talk about how you're going to run your verification, but really it's really more about planning for verification throughout the development. It's best that we consider tests early and carry it throughout the project. We know and understand that there are often constraints that come into play that don't allow the test considerations and teams to be involved early. We have seen, Dave and I can appreciate and have seen the benefits of doing this planning early on. It is hard, though, we understand, to actually see, because verification takes place way at the end, right? So where's that tangible evidence that this is the best way to do things? We do often learn later on when requirements perhaps are not well understood by the test team, or we need certain tools in order to fully test something. Or if we are recognizing a failure is coming because we didn't fully implement the requirement properly, that planning is really a big part of what needs to be done in a project. And we do all understand, what goes into a good requirement, right? Unambiguous, unique, testable. We do put a lot of emphasis on the first two, unambiguous and unique, making sure that there's no question on what it is, and that we don't have repeat requirements. But often the consideration for the testing of the requirement isn't fully appreciated early on. So how can we do this better?
So one of the things I also want to emphasize there is, as a program manager, and Tricia plays that role as well, that's the person that has the visibility to the whole entire project. So they're the one that needs to emphasize bringing in QA at the right times during the project, making sure, again, that QA is involved in early reviews, that everyone understands what the test strategy is, understands what the critical items are to test, and really what the process is and what the flow of those test efforts going to be, whether when the protocols are going to start being developed, when they're going to be dry run, when formal execution is going to take place. So that really, again, it's really a partnership between the development team and the QA team.
And I think when you get those test engineers involved early, they can also help determine the most appropriate method to use for verification. So we all tend to think of verification as testing. There are other methods, to qualify requirements, analysis, demonstration. So first, understand when we use the word test, for the most part, we're inclusive of any verification method. But those test engineers will help identify the best method that should actually be used in testing those requirements, and can also request early any hooks or tools or functions that they may need to fully cover that requirement. And doing that real time with the development will actually end up saving time in the end.
Yeah, so again, as far as just putting in, different test methods, one example I can give is in my past life before Sunrise, I was working at a company where we were, it was basically a surgical device inside a room. So we had pretty heavy equipment hanging from a ceiling. So, there are standards in 60601 and other structural standards that specify how strong a bolt needs to be or a mount needs to be in order to mount equipment from the ceiling. We're not going to in that case, we're probably not going to build a room and, you know, bolt something to the ceiling and then hang 4 times its weight or 10 times its weight off of it. That's all going to be done by analysis. You know, it's a little impractical to go through that exercise. So it's important up front, you know, the engineers are going to have to work with QA and figure out what is the best method, and then, you know, do that analysis and make sure that it's checked and done right.
With regard to protocols, you know, as your project starts to progress, you want to start considering the best way to organize the testing. Is it detailed test protocols? Is it high-level test protocols? Do you need certain unit testing to cover some things? Integration testing. Consider also how you can apply informal testing to help build confidence in the device and prepare for the formal execution. This might be, you know, additional ad hoc testing, coming up with some smoke testing, or dry running. On tools, we want to determine what the tools are that are needed to get the job done efficiently. So choose the right tool for the job. Which ones are going to require validation, cannot be done early, which tools might be dependent on schedule and need to be set in stone. So consider what tools are needed up front to help the PM align the plan and get ready for the testing. And then reporting. A summary report is absolutely your best friend. A good summary report is key to a smooth regulatory review. It does not imply that the report is without failure. You know, there still may be findings that happen within the formal execution, though we'd all love a completely clean report. But it is one that tells that story and provides the evidence and detail needed to gain the approval.
Yeah, so one other thing I wanted to emphasize here is, you know, you can always, there's always a temptation to try and speed things up, cut corners, you know, try and jump into formal verification early. And in general, these things aren't going to help you. You know, if you take a risk-based approach, sure, 1 time out of 10, maybe you'll get a better result and everything will go smoothly and the project will be done for less cost and sooner. But 9 times out of 10, that's not going to happen. And some good planning up front is going to prevent those. It might take a little bit more in the overall project, but it's going to prevent those disaster projects where the schedule goes on and on and on, or the cost runs out of control.
All right, so planning. I'm sure that we can all tell stories, horror stories of the verification considerations not being done early, because verification is something that happens at the end of a project. And so, you know, we wrote the plan and then we went about our development, and then we get to the end and we get to verification. And of course, you know, we have X number of weeks to get it done, and this is the first time we're trying to test it. So this is what we're trying to avoid, because that's always a struggle. So when we talk about the verification plan and the plan, and we want to make sure that we're tailoring the verification plans based on the project needs, based on the risk profile, and based on the regulatory strategy. The benefits for planning for these early in a project. So that's what we're going to get into. The strategy, right? Which requirements are best suited for which method? Testing is always preferred. However, it's not always the most efficient or the most cost effective, and certainly is not always necessary. Consider analysis and inspection when applicable.
Okay, so a couple other things I wanted to emphasize here as well. So when you're doing your plans, one of the things you want to consider is what is the device going to be used for? So, you know, with COVID in the last year, so there's been a lot of devices that have come out and have been under emergency use authorization. So if you look at the FDA guidance for emergency use authorization, it really kind of guides you through what level of documentation you need to have, which certainly plays into the verification effort, really in the requirements definition effort as well. So there's a couple of different guidance out there. So if you're still looking in that space of doing emergency use, I would emphasize going and downloading those documents from the FDA website and reading those. Also, you know, so again, other stuff that I've listed here, so the human factor studies, clinical trials, or commercialization, they all need different different levels of testing. So with a human factor study, really, it depends if you're doing that under an IRB. If there's no significant risk at all, then maybe you don't need any testing at all. You just want to make sure that you're following the human factors protocol that you're going to run, and that the device will work so you can collect the data that you want to. For a clinical trial, you might be more in the space of just trying to do performance and risk-based mitigations without testing every requirement that you wrote. And this somewhat depends on your regulatory group's tolerance for the documentation and submission to an IRB, or wherever the controlling body is going to be. And then for commercialization, then obviously you need full verification. Every requirement at all levels, whether it's software, hardware, system, user need, all need to be verified, or in the case of user needs, validated. And then you need a full trail of documentation. See, somebody asked about FDA versus 62304, so that was actually one of the next things I was going to jump into, so I can talk about that a little bit as well. So the FDA or other regulatory bodies, such as the MDR for the EU, divide medical devices into classes. So in the FDA speak, it's class 1, 2, and 3. In EU, it's class 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. IEC 62304 is a software development standard. So it defines software processes used to develop software for a medical device. And they base their class on a risk analysis. So they either have class A, class B, or class C. So in the FDA speak, you can think of a class 3 device as something that is life sustaining, or if it were to fail, would cause serious injury and or death. And a class 2 device is a device that can cause an injury and maybe even a serious injury, but usually in a failure, it's either no harm or an injury. And then a class 1 device is really a device that has very little risk of harm once that's on the commercial, out in the commercial space. The IEC 62304 ratings are specific to software, but there are similar definitions. A class C software would be, again, a risk of death or other serious injury. Class B would be injury, but usually recoverable. And then class A is basically no risk in there. Okay, and then also with your verification planning, you want to look at schedule risk. So maybe you need redundant tests or redundant resources to make sure that testing is done in the right amount of time. You want to, we'll emphasize this over and over again, but you want to overlap the verification process as much as you can with the development process. Not formal verification, but at least doing dry runs and making sure that your protocols are developed correctly and test the requirements that you need to test, that you have full coverage, and that you're not going to come up with an unexpected failure during the formal verification process. And then from a regulatory strategy, this plays in pretty closely with safety class, but you may have different regions. So again, if you're going to Asia Pacific or in the US or maybe in Europe, you're going to have to look at, if you're doing EMI testing, you're going to have to look at different voltage ranges. So if you're doing Japan and Europe, you're going to have to look at, Japan is 100 volts. You have to look at 10% under that. So that's 90 volts in terms of how does the product perform in terms of performance and emissions immunity. And then, in the Europe side, you're going from 240 to 256 or 260. I can't quite remember. It's 10% over. And then even, are you using an IRB to allow the product for clinical use, or is this going to be regulatory cleared when it's first used on a patient for a 510K, or do you actually need to do a full clinical trial route using a PMA? And all these will play into exactly how much verification you need to do, also how you write your requirements, how you structure the verification tests, and the reporting that you do on them.
So why don't I jump in, because we have a couple questions that came in. And I think they'll probably relate to what we're talking about here. So we have a question from Mark. Can you use the automated software testing tools? And if so, does the tool need to be validated?
So yeah, there's reasons to and not to use automated testing. I'll let Trisha talk to the validation side, and I'll talk to the tool side. It really depends on the nature of your project. So if you, automation tools are, I think, really helpful in two ways. One is as you're developing the software and you're using continuous integration and continuous builds, the software automated testing can tell you if you broke something on a daily check-in build. And also the other place that I think it's really helpful is if you plan to do a lot of releases, and in particular, if some portion of your software is static. So, just going to throw out an example. So you have a UI that interfaces to some other medical device or some other piece of hardware, and you're pretty sure that that other piece of hardware is not changing. You could you could stub in like a simulator and do automated testing on that messaging protocol back and forth. Whereas on the UI, maybe that's something that's continuously evolving, and that will be significantly more challenging to do automated testing on. So it depends somewhat on the situation, but if it's something where you're going to repeat tests, then once they're automated, they're obviously very easy to run and can run themselves. So
it also depends on the risk profile of what the automated test is covering. So this is to answer the validation question. I mean, the easy answer would be yes, but we have seen situations where you have something that maybe is testing something that is not necessarily critical in any way, shape, or form, might cover some certain aspects of a functionality, or like a repeated press of something. And we've been asked, can we actually maybe take this and call it more like soup and have a soup form for it, validated under soup, rather than like a full list of requirements and go through the rigor of validation. So it really does depend on what it is that the automated test is actually testing.
Right, and here's a couple more questions here. The FTA interpretation of 60601 versus 61010 for laboratory instruments. I don't know which one of you can grab that one.
I can talk a little bit about it, and Tricia probably can fill in where I mistake. But so 60601, the biggest difference between 60601 and 61010 is in terms of the applied part. So they're both safety standards, mostly electrical safety standards. They go through a lot of similar clauses. So the biggest difference between them is if you have a medical device that has a applied part, which is a part that would contact the patient, then you would need to follow 60601 versus 61010. I don't know if that fully answers the question or not, but.
Well, there's a second part that says appear to require 60601 for all. So I don't know if that's a clarification.
Yeah, no, that's certainly, what regulatory standards you're going to need to follow is very dependent on the project that you're running and developing. If it's a diagnostic type equipment that again doesn't have patient contact, then 61010 is certainly the standard to follow. Even with 60601, there's lots of collateral standards as well. So you have like the human factor standards, home use standards, that type of thing, and then you have the particular standards for imaging, radiation delivery, etc.
Great. Tricia, did you want to weigh in on that, or do you?
I think Dave covered it pretty well, unless there's some additional question on.
Okay, great. And then I believe it's a question just asking for a definition on essential design outputs.
Essential design outputs. So there's two things here that I think are often overlapping and often confused. So one is the FDA, a long time ago, 10, 15 years ago, came out with this concept of essential requirements and essential design outputs. So that's usually a tracing exercise. So you would, as part of your requirements, you define what your essential requirements are, and then you would want to make sure that your essential outputs match up with those requirements. So if you have, just thinking off the top of my head, but yeah, so if you have some physical requirement that, something maybe such, I don't know, just won't break under some load, something like that. That can be an essential requirement, and then your essential output would be some measurement on the drawing. So if it's, it could be a material call out on the drawing, it could be a thickness of the part on the drawing, something like that. What I think becomes a little bit trickier and something to keep in mind is in 60601, and there's also something called essential performance. So essential performance and essential requirements as defined by the FDA are not necessarily overlapping. And in a lot of cases, I recommend that they are not overlapping, because you can really sort of write yourself into a conundrum if you do that. So in terms of essential performance, that is usually a definition that's given to a national testing laboratory like UL or TUV as part of the 60601 definition. And that allows you to specify what the device, I hate to use negative requirements, but what the device cannot do in the face of EMI, EMC, drop, ESC, all those types of conditions that the testing laboratory will put your device under. So if you were to write that your essential performance is just equal to all of your essential requirements, then when you get into 60601 testing and your device gets hit with ESD and it maybe even shuts down or is irrecoverably damaged, right? It's no longer functional and it just shuts off. That may be a safe situation depending on what your device does. It might be better to shut off than to function not correctly. But if you have some requirement in there that you've pointed to that says, you know, the device shall deliver fluid accurately, and your device shuts down, it's no longer delivering fluid. So now you have a real hard time getting through 60601 unless you make your device, in essence, fail safe. Like it has to keep performing even when failures occur. So it's definitely something to consider and put a lot of thought into as you're defining both essential performance and essential requirements. So that's kind of a wordy answer, but hopefully that was clarifying and not confusing.
Very thorough. Okay, so that's the questions we have right now. I'll pop back in if they start popping up again. Thanks, guys.
All right, so one other thing I wanted to go over just quickly before we move on from the plans. So as you're planning stuff out, you just need to consider the flow of materials and really all the tests that you need to do. I talked quite a bit about like 60601 testing, but that can be really lengthy. So, you know, when do you start that? When is that going to be finished? You know, a lot of times that can take, you know, multiple months, and it can also take, you know, a month or more just even to get into the queue for one of those testing agencies. Another consideration along the same lines would be, again, like flow materials. So if you have a disposable that you're building, do you need to sterilize it first? Do you need to package it first? Do you need to do shipping testing before you do performance testing? And again, you know, you need to verify all of those requirements, whether it's shelf life or performance, but you need to consider what order are you doing those tests in to make the tests the most valid you can make them, but still getting through the testing process efficiently.
All right, protocol is one of my favorite topics. So, you know, Dave's going to talk in just a second, but I just want to point out, I'm always telling my test managers and my test engineers to consider smart test planning. Smart test planning. How are you going to break up your protocols? How do you want the device tested? And one of the key things is when you run into a situation where you are likely to have some regression, how do you want to handle that? You got to think about all those things up front.
Yeah, and I would also put in there, are there certain tests that you want to run, you know, whether it's regression or any other reason you want to run over and over again. So I think a couple good examples would be, you know, if you plan on doing subsequent releases, do you want to put all of your risk mitigations in one protocol or two protocols, something like that? Do you want to put your labeling testing into its own protocol so that you can easily rerun those? And then the other one might be performance testing. But if there's a lot of requirements that are just like, well, you know, the UI must have this feature, or, you know, this feature needs to work in a certain way, then, you know, maybe those can get sort of lumped together in one larger protocol. But on that note, I would, and I think Trisha would reiterate this as well, is not to make the protocols too large, because no matter what your best intentions are, you're going to rerun some portion of your protocols, and it just becomes a little bit of a paperwork nightmare to sit there and justify why you ran, test case 13 out of 25 test cases that are all in a single protocol and didn't have to rerun the others. If you had, 10 protocols and each had 2 test cases, it might be a little bit easier case to justify when you're rerunning. A couple other cautionary tales about protocols I've seen in past lives where people have, in essence, written a requirement into a test protocol. So I think you want to test the requirements as they're written and as they're given. But the example in this case was working on a software release, and the software was meeting all the requirements, and then someone said, well, it's failing, test step 35 or whatever the number is. And I'm like, well, that's not a requirement. And they're like, well, that's the way the field product works. So every product that ships now has to have that same feature. And I'm like, well, that's a requirement, right? So those types of requirements should be fed back into the requirements documents so that you're kind of always in sync with the development team and the QA team. The other one I would put out as a caution is just to make sure you consider, when you're writing a protocol or writing test steps, make sure you consider all aspects of a requirement. So you may have a requirement that, it's everyone's best intentions. If for some reason it's a compound requirement, it's got maybe 2 clauses in it, like, the system shall do something if the app is force quit or if the app is crashes. So you probably need to find a way to make the app crash and find a way to force quit it if it's on a phone, a smartphone or something like that. So you can test that whatever that feature is that you need happens in both cases and not just one or the other. And then when you're writing protocols, one other thing I would say, this we've done with the last couple companies, I think it works well, is you always have to write a series of steps to get to the meat of the protocol, which is testing a certain requirement. So I've seen places where people have written that each one of those steps is a pass-fail. So, you have power on the device, pass-fail, log in, pass-fail. And then you finally get to the requirement that says the system shall do blank. And that's really where the pass-fail is. The other steps are just steps that you need to complete to get to the test. So I would put in, instead of a pass-fail criteria, just say it's done, it's complete, something like that. I think it makes for easier reporting in the end.
To tie this just back into some of the comments Dave made and with requirements, this is where it's really important to make sure that those requirements are unambiguous, because if they're vague, the tendency is to potentially draw conclusions or make up requirements when writing protocols. So it's really, really important for those requirements to be well understood, not only by the development team, but by the test team, to make sure that they're very clear. In going through the test case development, you want to make sure that you're considering your tolerances, those boundary conditions, different input types. Anything that you might have that might be a repeated step within your protocol, pull it out, put it in a test routine. Know that you're going to have red lines and things that are going to have to get written up so that you can, get that process flow down and understand that, red lines typically are for minor changes, not for major rewrites, not for, changed test steps. Your level of detail here, it should be enough to guide the user. And this is one of the considerations that you want to make upfront when you're looking at the strategy. How detailed does one protocol have to be versus maybe another protocol? Maybe you have a protocol that really kind of covers your accessories. Maybe you have the option for an external keyboard or mouse to go along with your touch screen or something of that nature. Do you need the same sort of rigor around that protocol that maybe you need for your error condition testing? So consider how do our protocols need to be structured? What is in our case, what is the client looking for? How detailed are they expecting the protocols to be? Do they want to use them ongoing for future feature development enhancements? And they want to make sure that You know, it's going to be a novice user that would be running these protocols. Therefore, they need to be very explicit in, you know, turn the machine on here and have a picture of the switch, versus somebody who might be well accustomed to using the device itself. What type of equipment is going to be needed? Do you need recording devices? Do you need build information? You know, what is needed in order to successfully run these protocols and to get them written appropriately? And then along with the protocols are also, you know, making sure that you're reviewing, I would say real time, your NRTL checklists. So ideally, we'd like to review these when we're doing design reviews. So have them in front of you. Typically, it would be in part. You would not be going through that whole NRTL checklist at every design review, but parts of it are going to be applicable to what it is that you're trying to review. And it's important to do that real time because it helps get you the links for what you need, pointers to, you know, where in the design these things are developed and then tested. And then when you're breaking up your protocols and you're doing your test planning, consider the coverage that's needed for the requirements. Consider the risk associated with those requirements. Do they come from your hazard analysis? Do they come from your FMEAs? Did you have anything else to add?
I saw one question pop up there. So it was, what is NRTL? So NRTL stands for Nationally Recognized Test Laboratory. So this would be UL, TB, Intertech, etc. So if you have a standard like 60601 and you're not self-certified, which most companies are not, then you're going to have to hire someone to verify that your product meets that standard. And that's one of those companies. And
so we did have a question come in, guys. David asked, can the requirement implementer be the formal tester?
And the requirement implementer, so like the development engineer be the one that tests it. It's typically, the answer is no, that is not something that you would want to do.
Yes, I did.
And we actually don't even have our protocol owner be the one to test the protocol under formal conditions. So in our case, we have a test team. It's usually made up of, you know, two to however many test engineers are required for the project. A lot of times led by a test manager who's responsible for gathering all of the data and reviewing all the protocols, approving protocols, and then getting the final report done. But when we have the protocols being written up, we try our best to make sure that if you wrote a protocol, you're not the one actually executing the protocol under test.
So no more questions on this round.
Oh, no more questions. I thought you said a number of questions. I apologize.
No, sorry. I'm going to pop back off. So
one last thing that I do want to mention here, I think we mentioned it again, is also, you know, have some consideration again for regression. Have regression in mind. What's the likelihood of regression taking place, especially on your critical function protocols or anything that would touch essential performance, as Dave talked about a little bit before. What do we anticipate is our level of confidence in not needing regression testing? Because you may want to plan that into how you break up your protocols as well.
Okay, so tools. So we wanted to talk a little bit about tools as well, and I think the tools fall into a couple different categories. One category might be just tools you need to perform the verification, such as fixtures or software tools, and the other would be tools to help you organize yourself in the process. So we'll start with the latter. So requirements tools and test management tools. So there's a lot of different tools out there. There's Helix, there's JAMA, there's Doors, you know, lots of different projects. There's I did a survey on them a while ago. There was like 50. I was a little surprised. And the benefits there really is in the tracing department. So they are a little bit more effort to set up front. So I think a lot of people are tempted just to jump right into Word or Excel and start writing requirements. But I think when you start using the risk management or requirements management tool for risk management, tracing between user needs, system requirements, and lower level requirements, and then tracing to test cases, the benefit pays off at the end many times over. And I think the thing that I've seen happen multiple times when you're not using a requirements tool are a couple things. One is that you end up a lot of times having a trace document and then sometimes a requirements document that are separate, and synchronizing the language and of the requirements between those becomes very challenging and very time consuming. It's really hard to determine if you have full coverage on a requirement, either in terms of a user need breaking out into system requirements or potentially a system requirement breaking out into test cases. So again, it's just a challenge. And then the other place that those types of tools can really help is in regression analysis. So if you go back and change a user need or change a system level requirement, you can say, okay, what software, hardware requirement does that test to, and what test cases need to update from that, rather than trying to without it, you might be kind of hand searching through each protocol to say, was this test case tested here? No, it's actually in protocol 3 instead. So that's one. I would definitely encourage people to look into them. I know that requirements management tools can be pricey for sure. There are some alternatives that are not as pricey. There are sometimes there's add-in packages to like some of the Atlassian products like Jira. You can also use Helix is one that's a little bit less expensive than some of the others. Jama and Doors are, they're expensive for sure, without question, but they do offer a lot of value. As far as Agile methodologies, so at Sunrise, we use Agile to develop software and hardware. It's a little bit stronger on the software side, but we use it for both. And there's a couple of ways that I think this really helps with the QA preparation and really exploratory testing. So the process that we use, we'll just take software as an example, is we have a Jira story. It tells the developer what they need to implement. They implement that. It actually gets code reviewed right then and there before it's brought into the main trunk of code. Then it's available. A QA person can load that version. They can do exploratory testing. They could drive on a protocol against that particular feature, or just maybe a couple steps of a protocol to make sure that the protocol is developed right, and make sure that if there are any anomalies, that they're finding them before you get into formal verification, where it's much more costly to fix them and much more process to fix them. They can, at this point, if you're in the middle of a Agile sprint, you can just push the story back to the developer and say, yeah, you got 3/4 of the feature right, but it needs a little bit of work here, and then they can get fixed and get tested right then and there in the same sprint. So you're making sure that you're developing quality code by doing integration testing as you go along, doing code reviews as you go along, and you're also working to get the protocols in good shape and dry run before you get into formal verification. So they really kind of work together quite nicely.
So we touched on tool validation a little bit earlier, but just to add on to some things with regard to tool validation is consider what custom tools and fixtures are needed to be created in order to execute the tests. Those tools will have to be validated for the way that they're going to be used in verification. And doing that and knowing some of those things up front can help, take some of the pressure off the schedule when you're in the crunch time to complete the verification, that you don't also have to get through tool validation at the same time. And then, some fixtures might take some time to develop and verify. You may need, let's say, a battery cycle fixture. You have to get that built. You have to get that, wrung out and make sure that it's actually functioning properly. And then you have to get that validated before you can actually use it to collect your data and verification. Same is true, for any sort of button cycle fixture, any of those things. So consider what fixtures are going to be needed. It may also make it easy during development to understand, what might be needed for these fixtures for verification, and also what fixtures they may want to take into, let's say, manufacturing to also be used as a build tool. So consider the tools that you're going to be using early.
Just one last thing on tools that before we move on is in terms of test method validation. So you want to give consideration to, is your test method going to give you the results that you expect it to? So this has become a little bit more of a hot topic for the FDA in the last 5 to 10 years, maybe. But and I don't want to delve too deep in it, but you just want to make sure that if you're measuring some value, that the equipment you're using to measure it has the needed resolution in order to produce an accurate measurement, and also that any equipment that you're using is not actually influencing the measurement that you're taking.
Great, and I do have a question from the audience, guys. It's a bit of a long one, so I'm gonna read. It looks like it's a two-part question. I'll read the whole question, and then we can divvy it up. With regards to regression/requirements tracking, what is the best practice for handling obsolete requirements once all the stakeholders agree that this requirement is outdated, no longer relevant or needed? Should the requirement in question be removed entirely from the tracking tool, or should it be maintained and be marked as obsolete or some other indicator?
Okay, so actually, so there's going to be two answers, and it kind of depends on where you are with your requirements. If your requirements have been officially signed off, I'm sorry, if your requirements have not been officially approved and you're still kind of in the development process of requirements, sometimes requirements don't get approval until way down the line. I don't think that that's a good practice at all. But if your requirement is going to be retired before you've done any sort of formal approval, I think at that point it's safe to simply delete that requirement because it's never been seen, let's say. Once you actually approve your requirements, it's best to keep track of those requirements that you've retired or made obsolete. You can cover them in a separate section, which just basically stacks up the obsolete requirements. You just have to make sure that you remove the trace from that requirement as well, so that you're not tracing any sort of risk mitigation or verification to a retired requirement.
Great, thank you. We're good to move on.
Yep. All right. So execution and reporting. So with regard to test execution, you want to make sure that you hold your formal verification off until you're very confident in what it is that you're going to be running. It's very easy to fix things before verification. It's a lot harder to provide the justification once you get into verification. I think we all know this, again, but it's really hard to make sure that you're doing the things early and often so that you can set yourself up for a successful verification, because you have to provide safety rationale for any anomalies that you find in verification. If you find it before that, let's say in your dry runs or your ad hoc testing, it all becomes part of development. It makes it so much easier. You don't have to write any of it down. You don't have to declare anything. You don't have to come up with a justification as to why the device itself is safe at that point, because it all happened before. So let's see. I've already said some of the key things that you want to make sure that you do is that you, when possible, don't test your own protocol. Doesn't mean that you can't test your own protocol. No, it's a little bit different. If you are responsible for the development of let's say a feature, you're not supposed to test the feature for score. There's no real hard and fast rule that if you write a protocol, you can't test your own protocol. But I have found that we can often find, little errors or questions that come up in the protocol execution by other test engineers. And it may make sense for them to participate in that during the dry runs as well. And I would encourage that as much as possible. You want to take a risk-based approach to your testing. So what I mean by that is you really want to consider what your test strategy is. Do you want to test your most critical protocols first? Do you want to test the protocols that you have the highest confidence in, and you want to get through those first? Or do you want to test protocols that may have a higher dependency on some other external resource, let's say a tool or a chamber, and that might actually have a greater impact on the schedule? So understand the risks associated with your project and how you want to tackle your test execution. If you find something during your formal execution, consider these issues and determine if you maybe need to stop your execution altogether, or you push through. In some cases, it's best to stop, log the issue, talk with your test manager, talk with your program manager, make note of it so that it's captured in the report, and start over once it's all been resolved. In some cases, it makes sense to continue, see if you find anything else that you need to address. Sometimes it's best to just get all the information up front. Hopefully your protocols are all clean, but if you run into a protocol deviation, redline it, log it, move on, and be ready to have it summarized in the report later on. And one of the most important things during test execution is keep a clear log of any and all anomalies that you find. That'll make it, you want to make an easy path for going back and finding them once your test is completed and you're getting ready to prepare the report. So if you're using like a paper-based model, you might want to, you have pages and pages and pages of data. You may want to use little sticky notes right on the side there to help you find those pages where you had something, so you're not like constantly trying to look for, where did I have an anomaly? Where did I have an anomaly? So find a method that's going to work best for you. If it's done with an electronic tool, there are likely ways in which you can put pointers in so that you can find those issues easily. And then regression testing. So doing the regression testing analysis needs to be conducted when the device under test has changed, whether you have a new build of the software, something's been resolved, there's a hardware change that's needed, packaging, labeling. It's also sometimes required to do regression testing based on changes in the protocol. I think it depends on how major the protocol deviation would be. But again, hold off as long as you can. Get extra dry runs in. Dry run. That's like the biggest piece of advice we can give with regard to test execution. Dry run doesn't have to mean the entire protocol. Start those early. Do some smoke testing. Do some ad hoc testing. Start your protocols. Run through some of the things. Understand what your critical requirements are, and just make sure that you've really tested those requirements in their entirety. And for test reporting, so we here at Sunrise are huge fans of a summary report. We feel that it really saves a lot of time. So what we do is we create the test record. And this is really the individual protocol report. And then we create a summary report that kind of encapsulates all of the protocols. So let's pretend that you have 10 protocols for your system. You would have 10 individual test records, which represent the protocol report for each of those individual protocols. And then you have one summary report that sits on top and summarizes everything found and points to each of the individual protocols. It's a very easy way to understand. It's actually kind of anecdotally why the device is ready, why the device is good, why the device is safe, and why it should be approved. It offers that rationale. It does talk about the anomalies and why you may have an acceptable level of risk that remains.
Yeah, part of the reason that I like that summary report is it may may save you in your submission as well. So particularly on the hardware side, a lot of times you don't need to submit as part of the documentation package for, say, a 510K approval, all of your test records. You can probably just submit the test summary report. On the software, they may ask for some of the test records in addition to the report, but a lot of times you can just do this test summary report, and that keeps the the FDA in essence from looking at GDP and those types of, did you forget to fill in one box in a test record? Now they're like, oh, you got to correct this test record. Hopefully you can catch that stuff with your own review process. But if something's missed, you certainly don't want the FDA catching it. So for those reasons, I like the summary report. We also include the anomaly list and the anomaly rationale in that summary report. So we can say, yeah, it's fine to release the product for the initial release with this anomaly open for whatever reason, and you can do a risk analysis there. The one thing I would say about anomalies, though, since we're just hitting on that topic, is that the FDA doesn't look at the anomaly list as an open book forever. So if you're going to report something as an anomaly, which you need to report anomalies, you need to have a path to fix it. If something is not meeting a requirement and you are never going to change that functionality of that software, you should update the requirement and close the anomaly that way. Otherwise, when you go to do a follow-up submission or like a Delta 510K, you're going to get questions about why these anomalies are still open. All right, we're getting short on time here. We've been talking too much.
All right, so we promised you 3 tips. We hope we gave you more information than what's it, but we tried to summarize these takeaways into the 3 promised tips. So tip 1, plan early. The verification team should be part of the development team. Much like you would want a manufacturing engineer involved early when you're creating a device to help make sure that you don't hit those gotchas before you get the device moved over and transitioned into manufacturing.
Yeah, so tip 2, so just make sure you're matching the safety class of your product. We talked quite a bit about this. So you want to organize your protocols in ways that they can be rerun, regression tested, etc. You want to make sure that you understand the risk of your project and the regulatory strategy, just to make sure you're not either over or underdoing the protocols and requirement development.
And last, dry run, dry run, dry run. Can't emphasize enough the power of testing early, testing often. I know it's a cliche, but it's very true. Get through your tests, test your system and your software as much as possible. You want to ensure a smooth execution of your verification. And please also remember that verification activities include all members of the development team and not just your test engineers. Any last questions?
Yeah, we did have one last question come in, and thank you so much. And thanks to the audience for submitting questions throughout. I think it flowed really nicely. Question from Mutahar here. When recording data, do you use pass-fail or do you record actual data?
So I think we do both in essence, right? So if you have a test case that records the value, you want to record what that value was to the significant digits that make sense and you can measure it to. And then you want to also make a conclusion on that data as well. Is that data within your range, out of range, et cetera? So I think really, we would have both in there.
Yeah, in most of our protocols, if we have an expected value, it'll note that in the protocol. It'll have the expected result. And then the actual result, and then it'll say whether it was a pass-fail, and that makes it very clear.
Well, Dave and Tricia, you guys did a fantastic job. You answered every question that we had, and we had quite a few. So it's I think we accomplished a lot of things. I think people took more than just 3 tips away, but we definitely gave you 3, and I bet probably quite a few more. As you can see here, this is a little more information on Sunrise Labs. They're a great resource to all of our members at Mass Medic and to the med tech community in general. Just special thanks to Lauren Noel, the VP of Business Development over there. If you have questions specifically for her or any of Sunrise's capabilities, you can contact her. On behalf of myself, Mass Medic, and our panelists today, Tricia Boutot and Dave Hibbard, I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
My pleasure.